All right, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
This time we're taking on monotheism.
Oh.
You know, that belief in one God.
Right.
It's been at the heart of philosophy and religion for...
Millennia.
Yeah,
It's
millennia.
huge.
Complicated.
Oh, it's so much more than just, saying one God.
Layers and layers.
Especially for a philosopher, right?
Absolutely.
So for you listening, we know you're out there loving these deep dives into the really...
Nitty-gritty.
Yeah, the nitty-gritty.
Intricate ideas.
This isn't going to be some basic history lesson.
No.
We're going deeper.
Much deeper.
We're going to the heart of those philosophical arguments that try to make the case for a single
divine entity.
Exactly.
But then we're also going to...
Yeah, because it's not so simple.
We're going to look at the traditions, right? The ones that everyone calls monotheistic.
Right.
And see, do they really fit that strict definition?
Where's the nuance?
Yeah, where's the nuance? The tension.
Yeah, the tension.
The gray area. What's the real reason this one God idea has been so powerful and so debated,
Absolutely.
Still going on, the argument.
Across disciplines.
Exactly. So we've got a great guide for this journey.
Oh, yeah.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Of course.
Their entry on monotheism.
Is the best.
It's super thorough, super smart.
Rigorous.
Yeah, a perfect foundation for us to...
We really dig deep.
Okay, so...
Let's get started.
Yeah, where does this whole idea of one God even come from?
Right. Origins, right.
Yeah, like the historical roots.
Well, particularly if we look at the Israelites, it wasn't this...
like boom kind of moment.
Overnight shift. Yeah, definitely not.
Right.
A lot of scholars who study, the Old Testament, they say early Israelite religion, it was more like what they call
monolatry.
Monolatry.
Which sounds a lot like monotheism.
It does, but there's a key difference here.
A big one, yeah, for philosophers.
Huge for philosophers,
yeah,
right? So monolatry, it means worshiping one specific God.
Right.
For them, that was Yahweh.
Right.
But they weren't necessarily saying other gods didn't exist.
Oh, okay, so it's not like they were denying them.
No.
It was more
like Yahweh's our guy.
Like a main God.
Exactly.
Like a philosopher who might be super focused on...
one little area of metaphysics.
Yeah.
But they acknowledge other areas of philosophy exist.
Right.
They're just not their main jam.
Exactly. So less about like...
ontological.
Yeah, like there is only one God.
Right.
More about...
this is who we worship.
Our God.
Exactly.
Right.
Yahweh became their God, through the Mosaic covenant. That was a special relationship.
Yeah.
But here's what's so interesting for philosophy, right?
Okay.
Within this monolatry, we start to see the little sieves.
Yeah, full-blown monotheism.
Exactly.
Okay.
So very early on, they're saying Yahweh is the creator of heaven and earth.
That's a big deal.
It is a huge claim.
Like, even if there are other supernatural things out there.
Right.
The one who made everything.
Yeah.
They got a special kind of...
primacy.
Yeah, like top dog.
Absolutely.
You can't really top that.
You can't.
It's like, it just makes Yahweh's power
everything
like automatically bigger.
Naturally elevates Yahweh, right?
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting. In polytheistic systems,
Okay.
you often have creator deities,
Okay.
but they kind of become...
Instant.
Yeah, like they create, and then they're like, okay, you guys figure it out.
Right, they step back.
Yep.
But with Yahweh, it's constant. Like, he's the...
Active creator.
Yeah, involved.
Involved, yeah.
And that makes him
The ultimate sovereign.
Yeah.
Over everything.
That's a big step towards...
monotheism, for sure.
Okay.
Then, we see it again and again, they're saying Yahweh is the
greatest, the strongest.
the mightiest of all the gods.
Okay.
So at first, it's like he's at the top of
The pyramid.
a pantheon, a pyramid of gods.
Yep.
But then, logically, you could start to think,
Well, maybe there's only the top.
right? The apex becomes the only point. It's
Yeah.
like a philosophical argument.
Right.
It starts with, some things are better than others,
Okay.
but then it goes, wait, what if there's the ultimate best?
The best of the best.
And maybe that means it stands alone.
Nothing else can compare.
Exactly.
Right.
And then, the most important part, I think,
Okay.
this demand for exclusive worship.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Yahweh alone.
Like no one else gets your...
devotion, your worship.
Like full stop.
Full stop.
And that, for a philosopher, it really makes you think about...
The nature of value.
Yeah, what's ultimately...
Good, right.
Yeah.
Because they start with only Israel worships Yahweh,
Right.
but then it kind of naturally becomes...
Everyone should worship Yahweh.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
So those three things,
Yeah.
creator, supreme, and
Only one to worship.
exclusive worship.
They lay the groundwork.
the foundation.
For monotheism.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that you mentioned how other polytheistic religions kind of do similar things.
It's a recurring thing.
Like they elevate one god.
It's fascinating from a philosophical view.
Okay.
Because in a lot of polytheistic systems, when they're actually worshiping the god they're focused on in that moment, they treat them as if they were
the top dog.
Yeah, unlimited, supreme, the whole shebang.
Really?
They even give them titles that
belong to other gods?
Technically, yeah.
Wow.
It's like by being super devoted, you naturally start to
maximize.
Yeah, maximize their attributes. Like there's this internal logic of devotion that wants to make the God you love as great as possible.
So in that moment, the focus is so intense. Yeah. It's like the other gods just
fade away. Yeah. And that God becomes the ultimate reality.
It's just for that time. Yeah. It's like a temporary
functional monotheism.
Right, right.
And if you take that tendency, push it to its logical extreme. Philosophically,
you end up with
universal sovereignty, unlimited power.
In that one God.
Yeah.
And we see this happen.
And lots of polytheistic systems, they evolve. Yeah. One God becomes supreme, and the others, they become
like demoted.
Yeah, or like aspects or agents, manifestations of that one.
Yeah.
We see it in late paganism, some schools of Hinduism.
Right. Interesting.
So we've got this really interesting link.
Okay.
Between history and philosophy.
Right.
Historically, the move towards monotheism.
Okay.
Is driven by these ideas of universal sovereignty, omnipotence, total devotion.
Okay.
And those are the same ideas that form the basis of
philosophical argument.
Exactly, for God's uniqueness.
Wow.
So before we get into all the arguments, it's worth noting, some philosophers try to prove God is unique by saying, if there were two gods, they'd be
indistinguishable,
like
identical twins.
Yeah, and they use ideas like divine simplicity or perfection.
Okay, so let's talk about that first one, divine simplicity.
Right.
Or philosophy fans out there.
Yeah.
How do we usually define that?
Right.
And how does it connect to this idea of God being
unique, one of a kind?
Right.
So divine simplicity says God's not made of parts.
Okay.
And his attributes are identical with his essence.
Okay.
So it's not like God has knowledge.
Right.
God is knowledge.
Oh, okay.
Same with power, goodness, everything.
Interesting.
Like that old philosophical puzzle.
That's right.
Teacher of Plato.
Okay.
And husband of Xanthippe.
Right.
Two different descriptions.
Oh, right.
But they both mean
Socrates.
Exactly.
Okay.
So people who believe in divine simplicity, they say wisdom of God, power of God, sound different.
Right.
But they're pointing to the same undifferentiated divine reality.
Like different lenses, but the same being underneath.
Exactly.
Okay. So how does that radical oneness, rule out
multiple gods?
Yeah.
Well, one way they argue it is imagine two simple beings.
Right.
They both have simplicity, right? That's a given.
Right.
And some other property that makes them
unique.
Identifiable, unique. Yeah.
Okay.
But because they're simple, that identifying property, it can't be separate from their simplicity.
Oh, I see.
So they end up sharing the same fundamental
property.
So they're same being.
The same being.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating argument.
It is.
It really emphasizes that underlying
oneness.
Yeah.
But, philosophers, they're going to have
objections. Like, is simplicity really a property?
Oh, good point.
In the same way as wisdom or power?
That's a big question.
Right.
Some argue that it's a second-order property.
Okay.
Like a characteristic of God's attributes, not an attribute itself.
Oh, I see.
So it might mean all God's attributes are identical.
Within God.
Yeah, within God. But it doesn't necessarily mean simplicity itself is to those attributes.
Right.
Like, could a prime number be simple in some similar way without having divine attributes?
Okay.
If so, then simplicity is not a unique
thing about God.
Exactly.
Right.
It might be necessary for divinity.
Okay.
But not enough to prove there's only
one God.
Exactly.
Okay, then what about
contingent properties?
Yeah, things God has, but
could have lacked.
Yeah, like
creating this specific universe.
Right.
How do those fit into a perfectly
simple being?
Yeah.
And how does that affect the whole
multiple gods question?
Yeah,
that's a big challenge for divine simplicity.
Okay.
Because if you have two supposedly divine beings. And their contingent properties are different.
Like one made this universe.
Exactly. Slightly different one.
Right.
Then that initial argument from simplicity,
right,
it might not rule them out as
separate beings.
yeah, at some level.
Okay.
So they try to refine the argument.
Okay.
They focus on the essential properties.
Okay.
They say two simple beings with the same essential properties
right.
have to be identical.
Okay.
But even that,
right.
it relies on divine simplicity being true.
Right, which is debated.
Exactly. And it's still hard to explain.
Those contingent aspects of God.
Yeah, the things that seem
real.
Very real.
So the simplicity argument, it's elegant. It keeps things
nice and tidy?
Yeah, metaphysically.
Parsimonious, yeah.
But it depends on a doctrine that's really
complex and debated.
Yeah.
So maybe not the most persuasive argument for everyone.
Right.
Especially philosophers.
Okay, let's look at the argument from
God's perfection.
Yeah, this one seems to click more with
a lot of theists.
Yeah, for sure.
It just feels
right. Oh, okay.
like this argument, big names like John of Damascus, Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
They basically say a perfect God
okay.
has to be unique.
Has to be. Okay.
Because if you had multiple gods, that would mean at least one of them
is lacking something?
Yeah, limited, not fully perfect.
Right.
Like if one has a perfection, the other doesn't.
Right.
Or if one's got any imperfection mixed in,
okay.
then neither one is truly
perfect
without qualification.
So it's all about
maximal greatness.
Yeah.
If God is the greatest possible being,
right.
it's hard to imagine another one equally great.
But also
distinct, separate.
Yeah, because you'd have to have something
to differentiate them.
Yeah.
And that would imply one's lacking something.
Okay, so how do they argue this?
Well, they often categorize properties into imperfections.
Right.
Mixed perfections, those are good.
Okay.
But they imply limits.
Okay.
And then pure perfections.
Okay.
Those don't imply any limits.
Like
existence, goodness, love, knowledge, power.
Okay.
And the argument is a perfect God would have
all the pure perfections.
Yeah, all of them. Infinitely.
Okay.
So two gods couldn't differ in those.
Right. They'd both have the total package.
Exactly.
And they couldn't differ in anything else.
Right, because they're perfect.
No imperfections.
No mixed perfections.
Okay.
But then we come back to
contingent properties.
Yeah. There they are again.
Right.
Tricky little things.
So, like, God creating things, knowing specific events.
Yeah.
Are those pure perfections?
That's the question.
Or are they?
Contingent expressions of his perfect attributes.
Okay.
So they could be different between two
perfect beings.
Otherwise perfect beings.
Right.
Like creating might be a pure perfection.
Okay.
But the specific stuff God creates.
Right.
Is that essential to his perfection?
The content of creation?
Yeah.
Not so clear?
Not necessarily.
So maybe not all God's properties are
pure perfections.
It's debatable.
Absolutely debatable.
Okay, so if God does have contingent properties,
right,
then you could have two gods who are different.
In those contingent expressions.
Even though they have the same
perfect attributes.
Right.
Like perfect knowledge, perfect power.
But they know different things.
Yeah.
And they use their power in different ways.
Exactly.
Okay, so could those contingent properties really differentiate two gods?
That's a good question.
Especially if you bring in this idea of individual essences.
Right, the thisness of a being.
Yeah.
So it's still a debate.
But the perfection argument, as it stands, it does have
some issues.
Okay.
Now, Linda Zagzebski, she offers a more
refined.
Yeah, a more nuanced version.
Okay.
She says being holy or perfectly divine means you've got all the possibilities of divinity.
Okay.
So it's hard to have two beings who are both
totally divine.
Yeah, without them being
identical.
So
it's less about a checklist of perfections, more about like
exemplifying all of divinity.
Yeah.
Like if divinity has a set of essential characteristics, even a big set.
Right.
Two beings can't have all of them without being the same.
Okay, so it's like a limited edition.
Yeah, kind of, like a one-of-a-kind piece of art.
Right.
But the counter-argument is, can we really say there's only
one way to be divine?
Yeah, one fullness of divinity.
Right, like, couldn't there be different
ways of being perfect?
Yeah, different
modalities. Look at all the different ideas about God.
Across different religions.
Exactly.
And what about attributes that don't fit into those neat categories?
Right.
Could there be different?
Fine temperaments.
Okay, yeah.
Like different ways of being divine.
Emotionally or?
Yeah, emotionally, mentally.
Right.
Some traditions suggest that's possible.
Okay.
And if it is, then maybe you could have
multiple gods
without implying imperfection.
So both simplicity and perfection.
Yeah.
They give us some cool insights into
divinity.
Yeah, but they don't God's uniqueness.
Yeah, there are still philosophical hurdles.
Okay, so let's move on to arguments based on
sovereignty.
Yeah.
Omnipotence.
Yeah.
Total devotion.
Yeah, attributes that are kind of
universally associated with God.
Yeah, let's start with sovereignty. The idea that God's ultimately in control.
Yeah, ruling over everything.
And he's the ultimate cause.
Yeah, causally efficacious.
Okay, so how do these arguments work?
Well, one argument looks at the unity and order of the cosmos.
Right.
The universe follows these consistent natural laws. Yeah.
And there's this overarching
order.
Yeah, and that suggests there's one
underlying cause.
Like one designer.
Yeah, or maybe multiple designers working together perfectly. And consistently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this connects to that teleological argument, right?
It does.
That the universe looks
designed.
Like it was designed, yeah.
Yeah.
And that means there's a designer.
Right.
And then Occam's razor comes in.
Right. The simplest explanation.
Yeah, one designer is simpler than
a bunch of them cooperating.
Right. So if they both explain the order we see, one designer is
more likely.
Yeah, and even William Paley.
Right, the design argument guy.
Yeah, he said the unity we see might only suggest one
unity of counsel.
Okay.
Or one controlling will.
Even if there were
other agents involved.
Okay.
In creating or running the universe.
Right, but unless we have a good reason to think there are
multiple designers.
Yeah.
It's simpler to just go with
one.
Yeah.
Now, some people point to the evil and disorder in the world.
Right.
To argue against
single perfect God.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean there are
multiple cooperating designers.
Right. It just raises questions about the ultimate
cause.
Yeah, whether it's one or many.
Right.
It's about their nature and intentions.
Okay, but this argument, it's based on what we
observe.
Yeah, empirical evidence.
Exactly. It's a posteriori.
It doesn't prove monotheism is a
conceptual necessity.
Right, like it doesn't come from the very definition of the God. Exactly.
It makes it seem
likely.
Yeah, very likely.
But it doesn't rule out the possibility who just decided to make a
unified cosmos.
Yeah.
So Duns Scotus, he's got another argument from sovereignty.
Okay.
But more about gods.
Total causality. Okay, so how does he go from God as a total cause to God being
unique?
Yeah.
So he says, if something is truly God,
okay,
then when he creates, that act has to be the only cause of everything else.
And necessary and sufficient.
Yeah, of everything else.
Okay, so let's say there are
two gods and contingent beings exist, which they do.
Right.
Then each god would have to be both the necessary and sufficient cause.
Of those beings. Yeah.
But Scotus says that leads to a
contradiction.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if one god is enough to cause everything, then the other god's contribution isn't
needed.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Exactly.
So neither one can be truly
necessary
or sufficient.
Yeah. In the way a first cause has to be, they're not actually distinct.
Yeah. A very
intricate argument.
Yeah. What are the main
criticisms?
Yeah.
Well, first, like we said with the other argument, it shows that if contingent beings exist and they have a total cause, then that cause has to be one.
Okay.
But it doesn't prove God must be unique
in every possible
world. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
The second problem, and this is bigger, is the whole idea of
sufficient causal condition.
Yeah, it's a bit ambiguous.
Okay.
Like when we talk about causation in philosophy, there are different kinds of sufficiency.
Okay.
Striking a match is enough to light it.
Usually.
Yeah, under normal conditions.
Right.
But you also need oxygen, a dry match head.
Right.
So it's sufficient given those things.
Right.
That's a weak kind of sufficiency.
Okay.
Then there's strong sufficiency.
Which is
enough all by itself to cause something Scotus seems to be using.
The strong kind.
Yeah.
Which is tricky for theists who believe in, yeah, because then free acts are also
necessary conditions
for things to happen.
Yeah.
It's not just God's will.
Exactly.
So it's not the only sufficient cause in that.
Strong sense.
Right.
But we can tweak the argument a bit.
Okay.
Even theists who believe in free will would probably say
that God's activity is necessary for everything to exist.
Yeah, it has to be there.
Right.
And if contingent beings exist, then God's activity is enough to cause at least some things.
Okay.
Maybe in a weaker sense.
Right.
But still a real sense.
Yeah, given all the background conditions God set up.
Exactly.
Okay.
So with this revised premise,
if
you had two fundamental beings with this kind of causality, their interaction would create
problems,
logical inconsistencies. And then, if you add the idea that God is a
necessary being,
right, he exists in all possible worlds,
right,
then the very possibility of contingent beings.
Right. They need something else to exist.
Exactly.
That can be used to argue for God's
necessary uniqueness.
Okay, so that version is more
resilient.
Yeah.
It's based on God's essential nature.
As a necessary being.
Yeah.
And his role in the causal order.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about Al-Ghazali's argument from
omnipotence.
Yeah, this one's pretty intuitive.
Yeah, makes sense.
If you have two all-powerful beings,
right,
they could disagree.
Yeah, have conflicting wills.
And that would limit their power, and then they wouldn't be
omnipotent.
Exactly.
Ghazali's right. It's a strong intuition.
Yeah.
If you have two gods and one wants something.
Let's call it A.
Okay, A?
The other god has to either go along with it.
Right, cooperate.
Which means they're
totally independent.
Right.
Or they want the opposite. Not A.
Right.
And then someone's will gets blocked.
So someone's not omnipotent.
Exactly. They can't do whatever they want.
Okay, so formally the argument goes.
Okay.
It's possible for two people to want
different things.
Even if they don't?
Actively clash.
Yeah, right. So if there are two beings who are essentially omnipotent.
Meaning omnipotence is part of their nature.
Right.
Then it's possible their wills could differ.
Yeah.
But it's impossible for the wills of two omnipotent beings to actually conflict.
Right.
In a way that stops either of them from getting what they want.
Because then
neither one would be truly omnipotent.
Okay. So
the very possibility of conflict or